Welcome to our deep dive today. We're going to be looking at learning disabilities, specifically how they're addressed in Saudi Arabia. You send us these selections from a text by Dr. Ibrahim Abonyan. And wow, this is not your average textbook. It's got history, teaching strategies, even some insight into how Saudi educational policy developed. It's really fascinating.
Yeah, it is a really interesting mix. And it's important to remember that learning disabilities, LDs, they're not, bound by geography. They're global. But how a culture responds to them, well, that tells you a lot about their values. Saudi Arabia's system is pretty recent, formally started around 1993, so it gives us a unique perspective.
Yeah, what struck me was how Dr. Abunyan goes way back in time to set the stage, ancient Greece. To think that people were observing these learning differences then, it's wild. He even mentions Hippocrates noticing soldiers who couldn't read symbols, but their speech was fine.
It's amazing, right? Those early observations were key, even if they were puzzling back then. It's like they planted the seeds for how we now understand the brain works, how different areas have specific jobs. Even today, figuring out the root of someone's learning difference is so important for giving the right support.
Totally. And he doesn't just stop at ancient history. There are cases from 19th century Europe, too. There's this one that really got me thinking about a man who could write but not read. Can you imagine how strange that must have seemed back then? It's like these early observers were detectives trying to solve a puzzle, but with almost no pieces.
Absolutely. And their work led to some major breakthroughs by people like Orton, Fernald, and Monroe. Their names are like Education 101. And to see their influence in a text about Saudi Arabia, it's really cool.
Right, and their work was a huge shift, too. They didn't just observe, they started developing ways to actually help these students. Orton's work on phonics, Fernald's multisensory stuff, these are still the foundation for individualized education today.
It shows you this field has a really rich history, full of progress and also setbacks, of course. And that context is so important for understanding how systems like Saudi Arabia's, which was modeled after the U.S., came to be in the late 20th century.
Speaking of the Saudi system, there's this really inspiring story in the book. It's about these early Saudi graduates who were passionate about helping LD students. They were advocating like crazy, even setting up programs, real pioneers pushing for change from within.
It really shows how dedication can make a difference. And one thing you might find interesting is that Dr. Abunyan's text, it doesn't have in-text citations like we're used to. He references 3 of his own big works, but no traditional citations in the chapters. Might seem odd, but could reflect how they do academic writing there, culturally.
That's a great point. It shows how even presenting knowledge can be shaped by culture. Okay, let's look at the structure of this book. Dr. Abunyan, he doesn't just focus on academic problems. He breaks down learning disabilities across a whole spectrum. Language, thinking, emotional stuff, behavior, even social interaction.
And that's where this deep dive gets really helpful. He's giving us a framework to understand not just Saudi policy, but what LD students deal with anywhere. It's not just grades. It's about understanding the whole person.
So let's break this down for our listener. We'll go through each of these characteristics one by one. We'll use some specific examples, make it relatable. First up, academic difficulties. Most people think it's just about bad grades, but it's way deeper than that, right? Dr. Abunyan talks about this idea of cumulative deficit. Could you unpack that a bit?
Of course. Imagine a middle schooler who's reading at an elementary level. That's cumulative deficit in action. Basically, an LD can create this gap between what a student should be doing academically and their actual skills. Each year, the gap gets better, making it harder and harder to catch up.
Wow, that really paints a picture of the struggle.
Yeah.
And those academic problems, they spill over into other areas too, right? The book talks about language difficulties, which seem so basic but are so important. We're talking vocab, understanding instructions, expressing yourself clearly.
And those challenges impact life outside school, too. Think about all the situations where communication is key. Making friends, solving disagreements, asking for help. Language difficulties can be really isolating for a kid.
It reminds us that LD's reach is much broader than we might think. The parts that really got to me, though, were the ones we don't always connect to LD right away. Thinking patterns, emotional stuff. Dr. Abinyan doesn't avoid those less obvious aspects at all.
No, he doesn't. He highlights the link between LD and things like attention, memory, processing information. These are like the mental tools we use every day. Imagine trying to do a puzzle, but the pieces keep slipping through your fingers. That's what working memory problems can feel like.
It helps us understand those invisible struggles so much better. And then there's the emotional side of things. The book straight up says that low self-esteem, anxiety, even depression are more common in LD students. That connection was really eye-opening.
It's vital to understand how these things are connected, right? If you're struggling in school constantly, feeling like you're behind everyone, of course you're going to have anxiety. And then that anxiety makes it harder to focus, so it's like this vicious cycle.
It makes you realize we can't just address the academics. We have to address the emotional needs too. And even though it's tough to talk about, Dr. ابونيان brings up behavioral challenges as well. Acting out, withdrawing from others, even delinquency.
These are tough topics, but important. Sometimes these behaviors are how kids cope with frustration, with the anxiety they're feeling. It's not always defiance, sometimes it's a cry for help.
It all comes back to seeing the whole child, not just the label. And finally, there's the social aspect. Dr. ابونيان talks about how LD students can have a hard time with friendships, understanding social cues, fitting in.
It really brings home the human side of this, right? These aren't just kids struggling in class, they're individuals trying to navigate relationships, and often they've got this added layer of difficulty.
It makes you realize that supporting them requires this whole-person approach. We can't just focus on schoolwork. We have to consider the emotional, the behavioral, the social too. Now, something interesting is that Dr. ابونيان dedicates a whole section to middle and high school transitions. Why do you think that is? What makes this shift so critical for LD students?
Well, he actually quotes someone who describes adolescence as this time of storms and stress, which I think is pretty accurate. And for a young person with an LD, those storms can feel even more intense. The academic demands go up, social pressures are huge, they're trying to figure out who they are, and they're doing all this while dealing with the challenges we've already talked about.
And he doesn't sugarcoat it either. He presents these stats about higher dropout rates, lower graduation rates for LD students. It's a bit of a reality check.
These stats are worrying, but honestly, they're not surprising, given what we know about their struggles emotionally and socially. When you connect the dots, it raises some serious concerns about the long-term impact this can have on their lives, on their education, their careers, even their mental health. Early intervention and support are just that much more vital.
It really underlines how important it is to recognize these challenges early. Speaking of support, Dr. ابونيان keeps coming back to how crucial general education teachers are. It's not just about teaching, it's about identifying students who might have an LD. Why is this so vital, especially in a system like Saudi Arabia's that's still relatively new?
It's vital everywhere, but especially in a newer system. Teachers are often the first ones to see these things, the ones who spend the most time with the kids and can pick up on patterns others miss. They're in a really unique position to advocate for these students and make sure they get the help they need.
So they're almost like gatekeepers, in a way, making sure students don't slip through the cracks. Now, I know he gives a lot of practical tips for teachers. Can you give us a sneak peek? What are some of the things he suggests?
He talks a lot about classroom modifications that are good for all students, not just LD. Using visuals along with what you say, breaking down tasks into smaller steps, giving clear and simple instructions. Seem basic, but can make a huge difference.
It's about making learning accessible for everyone, regardless of their individual needs. It makes me wonder, what if we designed all classrooms with this in mind from the start?
I love that idea. And actually, Dr. ابونيان seems to agree. He emphasizes that these adjustments create a more inclusive learning environment where every student feels supported and like they can succeed.
It's about creating a sense of belonging and empowerment for all learners. But he doesn't just stop at the classroom level. He really stresses that teachers shouldn't go it alone. They need to collaborate with LD specialists.
Collaboration is key. It lets teachers share what they're seeing, get advice from specialists, and come up with individual plans for students who need that extra help. It's like building a support network, recognizing that no one person has to have all the answers.
It's that classic "it takes a village" approach applied to education. And it's especially interesting in the context of Saudi Arabia, where they've had to build these systems from scratch, drawing on models from other places, but also adapting them to their own culture.
Right, and that brings up another important thing Dr. ابونيان talks about. Ongoing assessment and evaluation. It's not enough to just put a program in place and hope for the best. We have to constantly check in, see how students are doing, get data, and make adjustments as we go.
It's about being responsive to the individual, realizing that what works for one student might not work for another. And that responsiveness becomes even more critical as students move from middle school to high school. Dr. ابونيان dedicates a big chunk of the book to this transition, and he's pretty frank about the challenges.
He is. He doesn't shy away from the pressures these students face. The academic stuff gets more complex, the social scene changes, they're figuring out their identity. And on top of that, they're dealing with the LD challenges we've been discussing.
He even quotes someone describing adolescence as a time of, and this is such a great visual, storms and stress. For someone with an LD, those storms can feel so much more intense, so much more isolating.
Absolutely. And that's why he has a whole chapter on the unique challenges of this transition. He talks about this risk of academic plateaus where students kind of hit a wall, especially with reading.
That image of hitting a wall really resonated with me. Imagine that frustration, that feeling like no matter how hard you try, you're stuck. It can really damage a student's motivation and self-esteem.
Absolutely. And he connects this to a higher risk of dropping out. He brings up some pretty scary statistics about lower graduation rates for LD students. It's a wake-up call that we need to be proactive about providing support, especially during this transition.
You mentioned those statistics earlier. They really made me think. Given that the Saudi system is fairly new, what are some unique hurdles they might face compared to systems that have been around longer?
That's a great question. One challenge could be just a lack of awareness about LD in the wider community. If families, teachers, even policymakers don't fully get it, it's harder to get the resources and support these students need.
It highlights the need for awareness campaigns, for education, as part of any successful LD program. But awareness on its own isn't enough, right? We have to equip teachers and families with concrete strategies to help these kids, especially during that middle to high school shift.
Absolutely. And Dr. ابونيان provides a ton of practical advice. He talks about helping students develop good study habits, time management skills, ways to stay organized. These are helpful for all students, but especially crucial for those with LD who might need extra support in these areas.
It's about setting them up for success, giving them the tools they need to handle the demands of high school. And he also talks about the importance of addressing the emotional and social side of things, which can be even tougher during adolescence.
He really pushes for a holistic approach. It's not enough to just focus on academics. We need to address their anxiety, self-esteem, social skills, their overall well-being.
It's all connected, right? A kid struggling socially might withdraw and not participate in class. A student who's anxious about their schoolwork might procrastinate or avoid tough assignments.
Exactly. And that's where Dr. ابونيان suggests things like counseling, therapy, mental health services. He also talks about creating a school culture that promotes emotional well-being and makes it okay to ask for help.
It's about normalizing those struggles, letting students know it's all right to need support. He even talks about how LD can impact self-concept, which is how we see ourselves, our abilities, our worth. It's something that resonates with everyone, I think, whether they have an LD or not.
He makes the point that LD students often develop a negative self-image because they've been told, directly or indirectly, that they're not good enough or not smart. Imagine the impact that can have on a young person's confidence and motivation.
It's heartbreaking to think about, but Dr. ابونيان doesn't leave us there. He emphasizes focusing on strengths, celebrating wins, promoting that growth mindset, the belief that you can improve with effort and practice.
He even suggests ways to encourage that growth mindset, praising effort instead of just outcomes, letting students learn from mistakes, helping them set realistic goals. It's about shifting the focus from I can't to I can with support and practice.
Such a powerful message. And it reminds me that we all have the ability to learn and grow no matter what challenges we face. And that growth can happen in all areas of life, not just academics. We were talking about how important those general education teachers are, especially when it comes to spotting those early signs of LD. But recognizing a possible issue, that's just the first step, right?
Yeah.
Dr. ابونيان, he gives us some real strategies teachers can use, and he gets pretty detailed, which I like.
Yeah, that detail is what makes this deep dive so useful.
Yeah.
He doesn't just tell you what to do, he tells you how. Remember we talked about that cumulative deficit? He argues that early help, especially with literacy, can really stop those gaps from getting worse. He even gives specific advice for teaching Arabic sounds, which shows how well he gets the Saudi context.
Yeah, that stuck out to me too. He's not just giving generic advice. He's grounding it in the reality of teaching Arabic.
Yeah.
It shows that you can't just assume one approach will work for all learners, especially across different languages and cultures.
Exactly. He even gets into the order you should teach certain sounds, like continuous sounds before stop sounds. He really knows his stuff. You can tell he understands how Arabic-speaking kids develop that phonological awareness.
It makes me think about those teachers who might be feeling lost. Like, where do I even start? This book gives them a real starting point, concrete stuff to try in their classrooms, things that have actually been shown to work.
And he doesn't stop there. He goes beyond literacy, talks about changing up the classroom in ways that help all students, not just those with LDs. Things like using visuals along with your words, breaking down big tasks into smaller chunks, making your explanations super clear.
Those are things that just make sense, don't they? It makes learning more accessible for everyone. Makes me wonder, what if all classrooms were designed this way from the start?
I think that's a brilliant idea. Dr. Abunyan seems to be on board with that too. He really stresses that these adjustments create a more inclusive learning environment where all students feel supported and like they can succeed.
It's all about creating a space where everyone feels like they belong, where everyone feels empowered. Okay, but we've been talking about these really practical things, classroom-level strategies. Dr. Abunyan doesn't stop there, though. He's a big believer in teachers working with LD specialists, not trying to figure it all out on their own.
Right, that collaboration is super important. It gives teachers a chance to talk about what they're seeing, get expert input, and come up with those personalized plans for the kids who need it. It's about creating a whole support system and recognizing that no one person has all the answers.
That it takes a village idea, but for education. And it's especially interesting because the Saudi system is relatively new. They've had to build all this support from scratch, taking inspiration from other places, but adapting it to their own culture.
Right, and that reminds me of another point he keeps making about the need for constant assessment, constant evaluation. You don't just implement a program and call it a day. You have to keep checking in, seeing how students are doing, looking at the data, and making changes as you go.
It's about being flexible, right?
Mm-hmm.
Realizing that what works for one student might not work for another. And that becomes even more important when kids move from middle school to high school. Dr. Abunyan, he spends a lot of time on this transition, and he's very honest about the challenges.
Yeah, he doesn't try to sugarcoat it. He lays out all the pressure these students face. Academics get tougher, the social scene shifts, they're figuring out who they are. And all of that is happening while they're dealing with LD challenges we've talked about.
He even quotes someone, and this is such a great image, who calls adolescence a time of storms and stress. For a kid with LD, those storms can feel so much worse, so much more isolating.
Oh, absolutely. He actually dedicates a whole chapter to this transition, all the unique challenges that come up. He talks about this risk of academic plateaus, where students just hit a wall, especially when it comes to reading.
That idea, hitting a wall, it's so powerful. And imagine how frustrating that must be. Like, no matter how hard you try, you're not moving forward. It can really damage a kid's motivation, their belief in themselves.
For sure. And he actually links this to a higher chance of dropping out. He shares some pretty alarming stats about lower graduation rates for LD students. It's a reminder that we can't afford to wait. We have to be proactive with support, especially at this stage.
You mentioned those stats earlier, and they really got me thinking. Since the Saudi system is pretty new, what are some hurdles they might face that are different from systems that have been around longer?
That's a good question. I think one challenge could be just the lack of awareness about LD in the community as a whole. If families, teachers, even policymakers don't really understand it, it's going to be harder to get the resources and the support these students need.
That's so true. It shows how important things like awareness campaigns and education are if you want an LD program to be successful. But even with awareness, you need more than that, right? You need to give teachers and families specific strategies to help these kids, especially during that move from middle school to high school.
100%. And Dr. Abunyan does a good job of that. He talks about helping students with study skills, time management, organization. These are helpful for any student, but especially for those with LDs who might need a bit more help in these areas.
It's about preparing them, giving them the tools to handle what high school throws at them. And he talks about the emotional and social stuff too, which can get pretty intense for teenagers.
Yeah, he really emphasizes looking at the whole picture. You can't just focus on the academic side. You have to address the anxiety, the self-esteem, their social skills, their overall well-being.
It's all connected, isn't it? A kid who's struggling socially, they might withdraw, not participate in class. A student who's anxious about school, they might put things off, avoid doing the hard stuff.
Right. And that's why Dr. Abunyan suggests things like counseling, therapy, accessing mental health services. He also talks about creating a school environment that promotes emotional health and makes it okay to reach out for help.
It's about taking away that stigma, making sure students know it's okay to ask for help. He even talks about how LD can affect self-concept, how we see ourselves, our abilities, what we think we're worth. I think that's something everyone can relate to, whether you have an LD or not.
It's a really interesting point. He says that a lot of LD students develop this negative self-image because they've been told, sometimes directly, sometimes not, that they're not good enough, not smart enough. Imagine what that does to a young person's confidence, their motivation.
It's tough to think about. But Dr. Abonyan, he offers some hope too. He's a big believer in focusing on what kids are good at, celebrating their successes, encouraging that growth mindset. The idea that you can always improve with effort and practice.
He even suggests some ways to encourage that growth mindset in the classroom. Praising effort, not just results. Helping students learn from mistakes, set realistic goals. It's about moving away from I can't and towards I can with the right support and practice.
That's such an important message. It reminds us that everyone has the ability to learn and grow, regardless of their challenges, and that growth can happen in all areas of life, not just in academics.
Absolutely. And he doesn't shy away from the social challenges LD students often face, especially during those middle and high school years when friendships are so important. He talks about how they might have trouble reading social cues, understanding nonverbal communication, navigating those tricky social situations.
It really highlights that supporting these kids requires a multi-pronged approach. You can't just deal with the academic side. You have to address those social and emotional needs too.
He's a big advocate for teaching social skills directly, just like you'd teach any other subject. He suggests things like role-playing, modeling, giving them clear instructions on social norms and expectations. He also emphasizes the need for creating opportunities for positive peer interactions.
It's about creating this inclusive and understanding environment where students feel comfortable being themselves, where they can make mistakes and learn from each other. He even talks about teaching them self-advocacy skills, which is so empowering.
Self-advocacy is huge, right? It gives students the tools to speak up for themselves, to ask for what they need, to navigate a world that wasn't really designed with them in mind.
It's about giving them a voice, helping them understand their rights, teaching them how to communicate their needs effectively.
He gives some really practical advice on how to teach those self-advocacy skills. He talks about helping students understand their learning disability, figure out their strengths and weaknesses, practice communicating those needs to teachers, peers, and their families.
It's about giving them the language and the confidence to express themselves, to ask for what they need, and to feel like they can take charge of their own learning.
He even gets into teaching assertive communication, helping students set boundaries, learn how to speak up in a respectful but firm way.
It's about giving them the skills they need to navigate a world that wasn't necessarily built with their differences in mind.
And that self-advocacy. It all starts with self-awareness and a positive self-concept. Students need to believe in themselves, see their own strength, and understand that their LD is just one part of who they are.
It's about helping them embrace their unique identities, their own ways of learning, and their potential to make a difference in the world.
And that sense of hope, that belief in themselves, is essential for dealing with the challenges and celebrating the successes that are still to come.
We've covered so much in this second part of our deep dive. We looked at the challenges middle and high school students with LDs face, and also the strategies and support systems that can help them succeed. But, like you said, there's still more to explore.
You're absolutely right. In our last segment, we'll dive into Dr. Abunyan's thoughts on effective teaching strategies, why early intervention is so important, and how to create inclusive learning environments that benefit all students.
Stay tuned as we wrap up our deep dive into this fascinating and important topic. Over these last two parts, we've really dug into the challenges those students with learning disabilities face, especially in Saudi Arabia. But you know what I like about Dr. Abunyan's book? He doesn't just lay out the problems, he gives us solutions too.
And that's what makes this deep dive so valuable for you. You're not just listening, you're getting actual tools, strategies to use, a way to understand how to help these students.
Exactly. He even gets down to the specifics, like those tips on teaching Arabic sounds we talked about. You can tell he's not just theorizing. He's been in the classroom. He knows what it's like on the ground.
And that's what makes his insights so useful. He connects the research with the real world, gives us clear steps to take, whether we're teachers, administrators, families supporting a student.
One thing that kept coming up for me was how much he emphasizes early intervention. Not waiting till a student is already struggling, but catching those early signs and getting support in place.
Yeah. He makes a strong case for it. Early intervention, it can be huge. It can keep those gaps from getting bigger, protect a student's self-esteem, and really set them up for success. He even talks about specific screening tools, assessments that can help identify potential LDs early on.
It makes sense, especially when you think about those statistics about LD students dropping out. If we can catch those challenges early, maybe we can change those outcomes.
Absolutely. And it's not just about formal tests and screenings. He also talks about using your own observations, your gut feeling as a teacher. Teachers who really know their students can often be the first to sense that something's not quite right.
It makes me think about that quote, adolescence being like storms and stress. Can you imagine being a student going through that but not understanding why learning feels so different for you? That could be so isolating, so overwhelming.
It's a powerful image, and it really shows how important it is for teachers to be those guides, to recognize the signs and help those students get the support they need.
And once you do identify an LD, Dr. Abonyan is big on collaboration, right? It's not just the LD specialist working alone. It's about creating a team. Teachers, families, administrators, everyone working together.
That teamwork idea runs through the whole book. He talks about open communication, making decisions together, having a united front when it comes to supporting the student. It's about recognizing that everyone has something to contribute.
That's crucial, especially in a newer system like Saudi Arabia's. Building those support structures from the ground up, it takes a real group effort.
It does. And even in places where systems are already in place, keeping that collaborative spirit alive, it takes work. It takes open communication, a commitment to putting the student's needs first.
And it takes flexibility, being willing to adapt, right?
Hmm.
He talks about the importance of constantly assessing, not just to measure progress, but to make sure what you're doing is actually working.
He's all about using different ways to assess, not just standardized tests, getting information from lots of sources. What you observe in the classroom, students reflecting on their own learning, talking to families. It's about getting a full picture of the students' strengths, their challenges, how they're progressing.
That makes so much sense, especially when you think about how different LDs can be. One thing might work for one student but not another, so you have to be able to adjust.
And that's where his focus on differentiated instruction comes in. He talks about creating different learning paths, giving choices, changing the pace or the difficulty of activities, offering lots of different materials and resources. It's about meeting individual needs.
That idea, differentiation, it's so important because it recognizes that there's no one right way to teach or to learn. Every student brings something different to the table.
Absolutely. And those differences should be celebrated, not feared. He encourages teachers to create classrooms that embrace that diversity, where students feel safe to try things out, to take risks, to learn at their own speed.
It's about fostering that growth mindset, believing that you can improve with effort. He even suggests little things you can do to create that kind of environment, like using positive language, praising effort rather than just results, celebrating even small successes.
Those little things can make a big difference to a student's confidence. And it's not just about what the teacher does, it's about creating that classroom culture where students support each other, value their differences, feel like they can speak up.
That sense of community, that feeling of belonging, that's huge, especially for students who might feel left out or different because of their LD.
And that feeling of belonging needs to extend beyond the classroom, too. He talks about having strong partnerships between schools and families. Parents and caregivers are so important in supporting their kids' learning and well-being.
Yeah, he encourages families to stay involved, talk to teachers, advocate for their child's needs. He also talks about creating a home environment that supports learning, whether it's having a quiet place to study, reading together, just having honest conversations about the ups and downs.
It's about recognizing that parents are key players in this whole process. And he also encourages families to connect with other families who have kids with LDs. Building that support network, sharing resources and strategies.
It's so important to know you're not alone in this. It's like that it takes a village idea again, but on a broader scale.
It is. And while we've been talking about the challenges LD students face, it's important to remember that they also have amazing strengths and talents that often get overlooked.
I completely agree. We sometimes get so focused on the difficulties that we forget to acknowledge their resilience, their creativity, that out-of-the-box thinking they often bring to the table.
Dr. Abonyan really highlights those strengths, the ability to think differently, to see things others miss, to come up with unique solutions. He encourages educators and families to nurture those strengths, help those students use them to reach their goals.
It's about shifting from a deficit-based model to a strengths-based one. recognizing that every student has something valuable to offer.
And that shift in perspective is so important for creating hope, which is something Dr. ابونيان emphasizes throughout the book.
He reminds us that an LD isn't a life sentence. With the right support, the right strategies, these students can overcome obstacles, achieve their dreams, and live full and meaningful lives.
That's a message we all need to hear, not just educators, but as human beings. It's a reminder that every person has the potential to thrive, and we have a responsibility to help create a world where they can.
It's been an amazing deep dive exploring the world of learning disabilities in Saudi Arabia. We looked at the history, the challenges, and we found some practical advice and inspiration along the way.
And even though we've been focused on one specific place, the things we've learned apply everywhere. The struggles of LD students, the importance of early help, the power of working together, the need for different approaches to teaching, encouraging that growth mindset. These are things that matter no matter where you are.
So as we wrap up, I'd like to leave you with a question to think about. What can you do in your own world to make a difference for students with learning disabilities?
Maybe it's trying out some of those teaching techniques we talked about. Maybe it's pushing for policies that are more inclusive, or maybe it's just being more careful about how we talk about learning differences.
Every action, no matter how small, can help create a world that's fairer and more supportive for all kinds of learners. Thanks for joining us on this journey.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time, keep diving deep.